Okay, so Professor John Potts is a professor of media in MCCALL, and he is the director of the Center for Media History. He's the author of or editor of 13 books, including The New Time and Space, A History of Charisma, Ideas in Time, and also he has edited The Future of Writing and Use and Reuse of the Digital Archives. Now, the book that we are looking at today, of course, is The Near Death of the Author. And I have to say, John, I absolutely love this book. It is erudite and expansive. It covers such a huge range of history, the history of the author, the history of the book, concepts of creativity, inspiration, originality, ownership, property rights in relation to literature, film, music, and art from the prehistorical period to the digital cultures of this present day. And, I think what's also really useful for particularly for students is that there is also a succinct and very clear chapter dealing with how post-structuralism and postmodernism transformed ideas about text, language, meaning, and authorship. And it's ideal for beginners who are, just learning about these theoretical concepts, but it fits into the book in such beautiful and clever ways. So it's, as I said, it's expansive, but it's also concise and really elegantly written. It's thought-provoking and ranges over many disciplines and subjects. And for me, it was such a fun read because it incorporates all kinds of curious facts and stories. And so it was just a really great pleasure to read. But John, the central, I guess, question in this book is really, what is an author? How do you define an author? So you argue that authors have inherited the role of the author as cultural hero established in the Romantic period. What does the Romantic author look like?
Thanks, Hsu-Ming, and thanks for the introduction. And I should have got you to do the blurb on the back cover, I think. Would have been a great seller. Yes, I spend, I think, the first two chapters doing a definition of the author. And as you said, there's a history of the author, which goes back to authorship of prehistory, which was a collective oral kind of authorship before the invention of writing. And I spent a bit of time on the Romantic period, who established the author or artist, I think, as a kind of heroic figure, which I argue is still there, is still with us today, although it's certainly challenged by different ideas of the author. First and foremost, you could define the author as a legal and economic entity, because since 1710, which was when the first statute of copyright was enacted, the author is a legal entity because their work, any original work they create, is protected by the law of copyright, which exists in most countries, not all, but most. An economic entity because the law of copyright allows the author to exploit the copying of their works and earn some kind of remuneration, generally in the form of royalties. And this was a product directly of the printing press, because before that there was no need for this kind of remuneration or exploitation of copies, because there weren't copies apart from what was done in the monasteries by hand. So yeah, I say that the authorship has been shaped by the available technology, the dominant technology of the time, first printing press, economics, and law. The author is allowed to sell copies of their work on the market, which is why it's an economic entity as well, so that the author's work is a commodity. But beyond that, I think in the Romantic period, which was the period of great poets like Wordsworth, Coleridge, Beethoven, the composer, etc., was established this idea that the author is celebrated culturally as or revered as a hero who is a creator of original works. And there was probably something almost mystical about the idea of the author as someone who should be revered, probably because this was a period of secularization in Europe, whereby earlier ideas that were religious or spiritual tended to be secularized and transferred into secular pursuits, such as authorship. And there's a sense that the author is almost like a spiritual custodian or guide, or the unacknowledged legislator of the world, which is what the poet Shelley called the author. And that's a kind of heroic status, which is why we celebrate acts of authorship. Now, that may have been a dominant idea of authorship, and for literary criticism, the idea that the Romantic author was the complete and original creator of their original works, perhaps semi-inspired, which is where the idea of divinity comes in, perhaps touched by the divine inspiration, perhaps a little mad, even a little unstable, but somehow set apart from other people as a heroic kind of figure. That idea was certainly with us all the way up until modernism, whereby the great modernist artists like Picasso or Jackson Pollock were considered heroic cultural figures as well, probably a little divinely inspired, a little mad, perhaps. That idea kind of grinds to a halt in the 1960s, I say in the book. First, in visual arts with the example of Warhol, who's a kind of anti-romantic artist, doesn't believe in this idea of inspiration or originality at all, is a very dispassionate reproducer of found materials, which are commercial materials in his artwork. And at the same time, you get the post-structuralist theory of Roland Barthes in his famous essay, The Near Death of the Author. And you mentioned literary theory and cultural studies. Anyone who's done that kind of literary theory would have read Barthes' essay, which is probably the most famous piece of writing about authorship. And it's actually about the death of the author. So my book is an ironic reference to that. What Barthes is signaling in that book isn't so much, in that a short article, isn't so much the death of authorship as a legal economic entity, but the idea of the Romantic author as this originator of divinely inspired original works, form of creativity. He is attacking that idea. He calls it the author with a capital A. He wants to dismiss the idea held by literary critics up till then, that if you want to find the meaning of any text or any work, see what the author's intention is, because the author was the sole originator of this work. Barthes hates that idea, rejects it out of hand, says forget about intention because the author isn't really the originator of that work. And he replaces it instead with this post-structuralist idea that language or culture itself is the genesis of these works, and the author is pretty much irrelevant.
That's a fantastic précis, John, and I'd love to just follow up on it, because early on in the book you talk about this idea of inspiration and breathing in, and they're coming from God and so forth, and as you've just said, that idea gets really we distance ourselves from any idea about God or inspiration or the spiritual or anything like that. And yet you do find artists, and some quoted in your book, in fact, who are still saying something along the lines of, it just came to me, or I'm just the conduit, yes, kind of thing. And I'm just really curious, are we talking about the same thing when we say that, as those pre-moderns who said, oh, it came to me from God, but we just don't have a respectable word for it anymore in the postmodern?
Yes, and I think for a long time in the 20th century, that idea of divine inspiration was replaced by a Freudian idea of the unconscious, because Freud developed the idea that art or literature is like daydreaming, whereby people get the connection to the unconscious. And for Freud, that's where all the creativity and ideas come from, because that's the repository of all these repressed drives and imagery. And of course, that was had a major impact on a lot of the art and literature of the 20th century in modernism. And that was Freud's kind of secularized idea of the ancient belief that all art or creativity has some kind of spiritual, doesn't need to be divine, it could be spiritual, because it probably goes back to shamanistic figures in prehistorical figures. It's the same idea of inspiration, which literally means like a breathing in of some other kind of force. And you're right, contemporary figures still, who are artists or creative people, still speak in those same terms in a secular version of what was once a spiritual or religious belief. I just read about a new book on creativity by Rick Rubin, who's rock and hip hop producer, who's worked with a lot of creative people. And it's all that. He says inspiration is when something hits you out of the blue and it's an idea or a feeling of excitement which comes from somewhere else, another place, and the work writes itself, which you hear many, many times. So it's the same idea. It could be seen as a romantic idea because the Romantics certainly exaggerated that idea, and they came up with the idea of genius, so that the greatest artist or author is especially inspired to the point of being a genius, like setting them apart from the rest of, all their contemporaries or their peers. Now, there are many contemporary theories in sociology, cultural theory, whatever, that would be called constructivists, that dispute this idea or reject it out of hand, that there's any such a mystical concept as inspiration. The sociologist Bourdieu and many others talk about the necessary social structures to be in place for art to be created. So they put it in a sociological context and dismiss the idea of inspiration. But still to this day, many creative people still talk about inspiration and still say this work seemed to come from somewhere else, that it seemed to write itself and I was just a vessel for it. I was taken by the comment by William Blake, the Romantic poet, writing about his great epic work, Milton, and he said, look, this work came to me against my will. It was forcibly against my will. I didn't even want to write it. It just came to me and I couldn't stop it. So that's the idea that inspiration is somehow externalized. The ancient Greeks called it the muses. There's this idea that something outside the self that comes in. Part of the reason I go into it in the book is I wanted to use that as a means of differentiating between works of art by human authors and those generated by AI systems. And you probably want to ask about that later. But some people say, look, an artificial intelligence system can perfectly well create any kind of work of art in any kind of form that a human author can do. And that's seen as like an existential challenge to human authors. But what an AI system can't do is have a kind of empathy or emotional engagement with characters that comes from human experience, because they have zero emotional capacity. And secondly, they don't get inspired. There's not this emotional charge of inspiration that human authors talk about all the time. So one of the reasons I talk about it as trying to develop, I think, a fully fledged idea of what an author is or a creative artist is, as some people still use that idea to distinguish human authorship from that of an AI system.
Interesting. And yeah, we will get to talking about AI because obviously it's huge and on everybody's mind. But one of the reasons I think AI is so confronting is that there's a kind of a cultural desire for an author that really persists. And you quote Andrew Bennett on page 66, the seemingly ineluctable desire for an author, and you quote Dana Paulin talking about. I'm just curious, we have this desire for these heroes with names, and I wonder why. Why is this so strong and persistent? It's clearly going to be a big problem for us when AI starts writing things that we love. So where we are, and I guess the other part of that question is, are we doing justice to collaborative creativity when we're pursuing this individual hero with a name and trying to identify and elevate them?
Yeah, you're right there. I do focus on this idea of what's been called the ineluctable desire for an author, meaning a single author. And one of the reasons I go into a history of authorship is to show that that desire arose from the invention of writing, of literacy. It wouldn't have been there before, because the great verse epics of ancient societies, including the Iliad, the Odyssey, Gilgamesh, were obviously collective enterprises. They were recited and memorized by a whole collective of largely anonymous bards or poets or musicians. And it just came down through oral folklore without an individual name ever being attached to it until the invention of writing. And suddenly, even Plato talks about Homer as the individual author of the Iliad and the Odyssey, when we know the written forms of those works are just transcriptions of a vast collective poetic enterprise that probably spanning centuries. And someone, whether it was a Homeric school, or there may have been a poet called Homer who was partly involved in translating, but Homer was in no way the author of those works. However, suddenly with writing, everything is individualized, and there's the need for the individual author that even Plato succumbs to. And I go back even further in the history of the author. The first known written author is from Mesopotamia, a female priestess and poet called Enheduanna, who there are still surviving clay tablets with the cuneiform writing of her poems from about 2200 BC. There's even a portrait of her, which shows that she had an elevated status in her time, and her the little clay tablets with her poetry on it is signed at the bottom with her name, and that's thought to be the first instance of a single poet or author who's named. That the first idea of a hero with names, as I call it. Before that, poets were part of a collective effort and anonymous without a name attached. Suddenly, within Enheduanna, you get the first instance of a named poet who is a singular person. And I think I traced through the book this whole tension between the idea of the author as a singular cultural hero against the whole massive culture and expression of authorship from ancient times, prehistoric times to ancient times, up to our own time, where which is where we come up with authorship in cinema that Karen will probably want to talk about, because again, it's the tension between the individual author from auteur theory, who's the director, who's thought to be the absolute author of a film, versus the alternative view that it's a collective effort of all the craftspeople, whether the film editor, the cinematographer, designer, the actors, all the hundreds of craftspeople on those credits at the end of a film that may take 10 minutes, they could all be said to be part of a collective authorship, but it's the singular author, the director, who's the cultural hero with the name. And as I show, copyright law always has an individualist bias to it, probably because it grew up in the age of literacy and printing presses, and an individual author's name was paramount because that's where the copyright went to. So film, which is obviously a collaborative enterprise at that level and a kind of industrial art, still there's the need by many people, theorists and critics, to assign an individual authorship to it. So that is, again, is an instance of that ineluctable desire for an author.
Yeah, truly. I mean, it's interesting, the desire for an author came up around film, as you note in the book, around the desire for film to be an art form and not just be a fairground attraction kind of thing. And so this idea of choosing someone as the author, it is very much a cultural idea. Hsu-Ming, did you want me to follow up on that, or
yes, I think so, because obviously because of what you do in terms of editing, right? And you've made such an argument for the editor as author.
So, well, one thing to kind of be aware of, I suppose, in film is that the author, I think there's some confusion really when we come to film between the idea of author and writer, because we generally, as John, notes, the idea of the author, or the individual author, comes up with the invention of writing. But in film, the writer is not considered the author. It's the producer or the director or some combination thereof. So I guess what I would basically say is that authorship, as applied to film, is a metaphor, and it could be improved. It's not, it just really doesn't describe what the manifestation of ideas is in the filmmaking process. And so it becomes quite tricky. And I guess, John, that has to do with copyright and authorship as an idea not kind of keeping up with technology.
Yes, because what they did was impose a very literate idea of the author, say taken from a novelist or a poet, that you could justifiably say is the agent responsible for that text that they've created, from an age of when the printing press was dominant. And they've tried to impose that on a mass industrial art like cinema, with many, many collaborators who've worked on it. And it just doesn't fit, as you've said. And it's also a romantic idea. There's this idea that there's kind of organic author at the top of it, namely the director, with this vision who makes everything whole, where as if they oversee the whole thing. Whereas I think you say that a better model might be that of a conductor or orchestrator that oversees all the people working on it, and make sure they're all moving in the same direction, rather than someone who imposes this very romantic idea of the singular author onto the work.
Yeah, I think you make a really good case, John, for I guess in some ways the corruption of authorship and copyright, in the present day, where where authorship is really about the holding of rights. But before I come to that, I just want to delve back a little bit historically and look at your argument about patronage, right? I mean, you say that prior to the 18th century, authors depended for their livelihood not on the sale of their works in the market, rather they depended on patronage, generally from the monarchy, church, or aristocracy. And then you argue that patronage was displaced by copyright, and that copyright now defines authorship. You mentioned already that copyright is both a legal and economic construction of authorship. Now, I'm not entirely convinced that the system of patronage is over. And over and done with, because I'm just wondering, in our particular context, could a case be made that the patronage system has been removed from the individual or class to the state, right? That university positions, research grants, government grants are a form of patronage?
Yes, and also we're in societies where copyright doesn't really exist, where there's an authoritarian state or perhaps a theocratic state, patronage comes from the state exclusively. I had a student in the MRes unit I used to teach called Studies in Authorship, and she was from Iran, and said, look, there's no copyright in Iran whatsoever. There's no market. There's no freedom to create. Your work has to be approved by the state, and you need to get a grant. So there is a kind of government or state patronage that exists in many countries. And of course, in other countries, creative works can be censored and removed from market altogether. So there has always been, you're right, I probably should have made more of an emphasis on the idea of state patronage, which is more marked in other countries, perhaps more authoritarian, but exists also in democracies, as in grants from the Australia Council or whatever. That's quite true, where you have to meet certain guidelines to be approved. Yeah, that's true. I do also say that with the decline in royalties from copyright due to illegal, streaming and downloading, we've returned to a different form of patronage in the 21st century, which is the crowdfunding type, like Kickstarter, where they have taken the place of copyright giving people royalties as remuneration. And instead, there's a kind of more democratic idea of patronage that the people on Kickstarter or Patreon or Substack, which are subscription services, are in effect group patrons of the author, because a journalist in Substack will write for the subscribers. So in fact, they're paying a salary, as which is what the aristocratic patrons used to do before the 18th century. So some people see that return to a patronage and of a more democratic mode as necessary to take the place of the lost royalties.
Yeah, I'm also interested, I guess, in where there is an authoritarian or model of patronage, whether it's the state or whatever, that it also seems to spur a lot of illegal practices of copying, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. And Karen, I think you had a question about the failure of copyright then in the era of big tech and all of that.
Yeah, just take it from there. That's the question. You know, what can you tell us about that? It does come up a lot in the book.
Yeah, first the illegal. I just wanted to mention one thing. I had a student who in the authorship seminars who was a graffiti artist. In fact, he's doing a PhD with us now. And I was interested in that because if I say the author is a legal economic construct and they get remunerated through copyright, that can't possibly happen if the artistic practice they do is illegal in the eyes of the state, because in almost all cities of the world, graffiti art is seen as vandalism and it's removed, and you can't possibly be remunerated for it, but artists still do it. So I looked into that with the students' help as a practicing graffiti artist, and a couple of things came out of it. One is, you're right, illegal creative acts, which graffiti art is in most cities of the world. There's a famous instance in Singapore where a graffiti artist was not only fined, but caned in the street because it was seen as such an illegal act. So there's no way they could be remunerated, but they do it anyway. So there is this idea that underground or illegal in the eyes of the state creative practice will happen anyway, even without copyright as the incentive to create. And secondly, there was actually a case where a graffiti artist's design were appropriated by a design company in America. And the graffiti artist did the unthinkable and took them to court for breach of copyright. And no one had ever seen that before. No one thought the graffiti artists would ever do it because they're actually criminal in what they do. And they always use pseudonyms, so they don't even have their real name. And they thought a graffiti artist would never want to go into court because they could be charged for a crime of the very artistic practice. But it was very interesting that the graffiti artist won a settlement. And the design company tried to argue, we can't be in breach of copyright because this stuff is illegal. It isn't protected by copyright in the first place. And that was thrown out of court, which was quite interesting and seemed to set a precedent that despite being an illegal art form, graffiti can be protected by the law of copyright. But anyway, I think Karen was asking something more about the infringement of copyright in the internet age. Is that right?
Well, yeah, I mean, we're very interested in, you know, so a lot of my practice comes from reimagining archives, for example, or, you know, the ways quotations and things like that get. So there's, I guess, another side to the technology, which is the creative affordances and how copyright and authorship intersect with that.
Yeah. I do a bit on digital archives because they have created a huge amount of new material, which has been in effect published, because archives, before they become digitized, are just hidden away out of sight. You have to be a specialist researcher to even get to them. But once they're published online, they're for anybody in the world. And some digital archives, like the one from Acme in Melbourne, are actually set up for artists and creative people to use the material for creative reuse. They've got the rights and clearances so that artists can actually use what's in the digital archive, artworks or film or video, as the base for their own creative practice, which is something entirely new. So in that sense, that's a positive impact in terms of creativity and its range of the internet and digital technology. Mostly, though, it's been had a very negative effect on authors. First, with the illegal downloading of music files from Napster from about 2000, which really destroyed the music industry and ruined the possibility of having a career by songwriters. And there are other instances. Jan Zwar, who's here, I cite her research with the economics department about the plight of the author and the pitiful amount that an author can make in the internet age, which is always cited, Jan, everywhere I say it, they say, and Macquarie University showed, what's the figure, something like a tiny amount, annual amount, largely because of illegal downloading and streaming, which then affects audio visual as well. So in a sense, the contemporary author has had to struggle to survive when the royalties they once would have received have been decimated, largely due to illegal infringement. On the other hand, there were some well-made criticisms of the old copyright regime, which was shown to favor not so much the author or artist, but very big, powerful media corporations that enriched them, and they weren't really in favor of authors as well anyway, which probably was one of the reasons that internet libertarians, free culture people, and free culture advocates were so cavalier in their rejection of copyright and eager to infringe it, because they thought copyright enforcement is just making corporations rich anyway, so we don't respect it.
Truly. And what about these practices and what, you know, the term you use is prosumer, the professional who's consuming and both making and consuming. How do you feel like these things have changed our understanding of the author and the transformative authorship?
Yeah, well, it completely transformed the relation between the media, the author, and the audience. Because instead of just passively receiving entertainment or culture, the audience is suddenly creating. They're doing blogs, or even if it's posts, or responding in some way and creating their own work. So that there's the famous description of the internet social media user from about 2006, that these are the people formerly known as the audience, meaning they're not passive anymore, they're creative, and that's why the prosumer. Fan fiction is probably a very good example of that, that rather than just passively consume their favorite text, whether it's Harry Potter or any number of works that create a whole story world, they intervene in it and do their own versions of it on fan fiction sites, which is called transformative writing. And there are many theorists in literary theory, cultural studies, who are strongly in support of that, because it often creates a new outlet for often marginalized voices who do their transformation of famous story worlds, often by queering them, changing gender, changing race, etc., and doing a creative spin, if you like, on an established story world. So that's a perfect example of someone who once may have been a reader, but then becomes a writer-reader.
Yes. Yeah, we're still dealing with human agency, though, with prosumers and writers of fan fiction and remix practices and all of that. But I think what probably everyone wants to get to is AI, right? So yep. One of the most fascinating topics you're discussing is the transition from human to non-human authorship. And you discuss the artificial intelligence systems called generative pre-trained transformers, or GPT-3. And there's been so many discussions of GPT-3, Chat GPT over the summer. And you came up with this concept of the digital scripter to explain the author function of GPT and AI programs. So can you tell us more about that, this digital scripter, and how it relates to the author function?
Yeah, the digital scripter has taken the idea of the scriptor from Roland Barthes' essay, The Death of the Author, which was from 1968. What he wanted to do was replace this idea of the romantic author as this all-seeing, divinely inspired creator of original works. He wanted to replace it with an idea of someone who's more like someone who is working with language, because he thought language and culture actually creates new works. And the scriptor comes from one of the medieval variants of an author. The scriptor was just someone who copied. So it was like a copier in the scriptorium in the monasteries, where they just copied a script without changing anything. So Barthes wanted to replace the romantic idea of the author with a modern idea of the scriptor. And he has these wonderful phrases to describe it. He says, they have no power of originality. All they're going to do is mix and rearrange what's already in the immense dictionary of culture. So he's saying the scriptor isn't creating original works. They're just assembling and processing information, if you like. And of course, this is before the age of computers and databases, but it's easy to transplant that into our age of enormous databases and the internet. And Barthes' immense dictionary of culture are databases. And I was taken by the fact that this is what AI does when it's creating a work. Say you ask it to create a work in the style of Jane Austen, write a novel like it. It's going to rummage through the database of all available Jane Austen novels. It has machine learning, so it's going to learn the rules of that genre and what's possible to write, and what the plot should be like, what the characters should be like. And it's going to come up with a new novel by Jane Austen in the style of Jane Austen, but all it's doing is going through the database of Jane Austen novels and rearranging the elements within that database like a digital scriptor, like what Barth's post-structuralist idea of the new author should be. In a sense, that's why some people are critical of the potential of AI, because it isn't doing anything more than imitating the possibility of a new Jane Austen novel or whatever the genre or form it's in. It learns all the rules of the genre and the various codes, and it ransacks the databases and reassembles something, but it's just assembling information. It doesn't really have any kind of empathy or human emotional contact. And look, if Barth had survived, he was hit by a laundry truck, I think, and killed in 1980. At the time, I believe he was writing a novel. So I can't imagine that he probably would have been aghast at the idea of what an AI would do as assembling information like a digital scriptor, when he probably would be looking for something more out of a creative work.
Yeah, I mean, you also make the same point in terms of music. You talk about that concert where, you know, there was the professor who had written in the style of Bach. There was a Bach piece, and then there was the AI program which generated the Bach piece of music. And a lot of the audience thought that the AI generated musical piece was actually the original Bach piece. Right. And so, you know, you've talked twice now, you made references to the emotional power of inspiration, right? Mm-hmm. Which is still considered the factor behind the creative act, and it's the thing that distinguishes the works of a human author from the outputs of an AI counterpart. But in Barth's essay, he talks about the death of the author and the birth of the reader. Mm-hmm. Right. So if we look at this emotional power of inspiration that separates authorship, that's viewing it from the perspective of the producer, but coming back to the audience, listening to the three Bach pieces. Mm-hmm. Right. If from the receiving end, the audience experiences the emotional power of inspiration, doesn't this blur again the distinction between the human and non-human author?
Yeah.
Right.
And look, there are many theorists, even in law, in copyright law, who argue that we're being speciesist if we say an author has to be human. I think in Australian copyright law, it actually says the work is created if it's made by a human author. And people have gone through all the copyright acts around the world to show that in current legislation, the author needs to be human. But there are law theorists and law reformers who say, look, an AI system can make a work that's just as good, or that you can't really discern, as Hsu-Ming was just saying, between the human composed work and the AI work. So therefore, shouldn't we accept that an AI system can be equivalent to an author and have the same kind of rights and status? And there are even some calls for AI generated works to be protected by copyright, like a human author's work, which are possibly a little crazy, because the AI system doesn't need the incentive to create, doesn't need any royalties. It's you know, it's coding. However, that's how far they want to go, and they accuse people who resist that as being humanist and speciesist, because the machines appear to be able to do just as well. Although I will probably add to that even the Bach example, the AI system did a very good imitation of a Bach work. It's still, as Barth even said of the scriptor, there's no power of originality. It's just reassembling and imitating, and that's ultimately what an AI system will do. I read there was one claim that AI systems could soon write all Hollywood film scripts, and that they had a test to see how well it would go. And in the, you know, the conventional 3-act script in Hollywood. It did okay for the first act, and in the second act, it went completely crazy. It was just going again off databases and having its machine learning to learn the rules, but it just didn't have the experience to know what should happen in the second and third acts.
Yet.
Yes, maybe. Yeah,
Okay.
you see predictions all the time that within 5 years, AI systems will write your Hollywood film scripts. And in a sense, it's all based on genre, you know, action, romance, comedy. In a sense, a human author learns the rules of the genre and creates something that appears to be a new or original within the rules, and AI system is doing it.
That brings disparate worlds together as well, right?
Yes,
We've probably got to move to questions soon, but one final question. So, given all of this, you state that you still believe the author will and has survived. Any revisions of that, especially post ChatGPT?
Well, look, when I wrote the book, ChatGPT hadn't emerged, and it's made a big splash. And of course, the universities are worried that student essays are going to be written by ChatGPT, and how we're going to be able to tell the difference. There are people who claim that they can tell the difference because a ChatGPT essay is still generic. It has something missing to it. I'm not sure if that's true. In the AI chapter, I use example of the predecessor from ChatGPT, which is GPT-3, which is still a very powerful AI system, which happily wrote an op-ed piece for The Guardian, given the theme of why humans shouldn't be scared of AI. And The Guardian editor said it did quite a good job, and it was easier to edit the various versions of it than for many human journalists. And so then people started to say, journalism will be replaced by AI. Journalists will be out of a job. Although even then, that's an op-ed piece that the GPT-3 could assemble from all the database across the internet of very similar op-ed pieces. I think it's a different thing to be an investigative journalist, because you're going to put together, come up with some original insight, make various links that come from your human experience as a journalist. It isn't just assembling information, it's making original connections.
Okay, thanks very much, John. All right, we'll move to questions now, which Karen will adjudicate. So as Karen has written, can you put your hands, raise your hands, or put the questions in the chat?
And yes, Virginia.
You're muted, Virginia.
Sorry, I just saw Paul had his hand up first. I thought I'd be intruding.
Don't worry, Virginia, go for it.
Paul Sheehan had his hand up before I did.
No, that's okay. I don't mind. You go first.
Okay, well, thank you for a fantastic session. I'm really interested to read the book. I haven't read it yet, John. I would probably debate with you, but at another time, about the death of the author chapter piece by Roland Barthes and some of his other writing, because we do know that his work on photography, for example, does tend to indicate there's this idea of the punctum in photography from an artist, that the photograph is this kind of original thing that is shaped by an author or an artist. So I suppose I would ask you, how have you managed to differentiate these terms that you're using, the author versus the artist? They're all problematic. They're all charged with so many different things. And finally, drawing on Barthes, how would you put in the idea of the author as someone who not just creates, but marks? Their marks are felt throughout a body of work, so that this idea of the body is very much connected to the author.
Yeah, well, I do a whole chapter on Barthes, because the death of the author is only 7 pages long. It's ridiculously short, and it was probably the most influential piece of writing on authorship ever, but also the most wildly misunderstood. And there were people in the 1970s, probably very earnest deconstructionists, probably in America, who took it literally and thought, well, Barthes declared the author dead. across all forms of practice. There's no such thing as the author. People won't use by names anymore, bylines. There'll be no names. It'll all be collective anonymous authorship. And that, of course, isn't what Barthes said at all. And I look at some of his later writing in the 70s, where he talks about the persistence of the author and the return of the author. And he says we have the need for the author. So I honestly think what he was doing was trying to dispense with the romantic idea of the author, which in his essay, he even puts in a capital A. The deconstructionists missed the difference between the little a, which is like the historical author, and the big A, which is the romantic author. And that's really what Barthes was attacking. And to a large extent, I think he was successful. You have to look at the ideas in the 80s and 90s of the postmodern author, whether an electronic musician like a sampler or others like all those visual artists like Richard Prince, who just appropriated. Sherry Levine, etc. The whole idea of appropriation art was following Barthes' idea of the death of originality, that all you're doing is processing information. So he had that impact, but I think he still felt the need for the idea of the author. Even Derrida wrote later on of the near death of the author, but the survival of the author, because it's a cultural figure we need. As for the way I use it, I think I stated very early that I use the author to mean not just the literary author, but audiovisual author like filmmaker, musician, composer, choreographer, visual artist, photographer, any creative practitioner whose work is protected by copyright. That's pretty much how I use it. And so a lot of it is about what happens when copyright is so wildly infringed as it has been, with illegal downloading and streaming. Does the author survive? And as Hsu-Ming says, at the end of the book, I say, yes, they do. They adapt, they find other means. We didn't mention things like NFTs. The NFTs have emerged as an alternative means of revenue for musicians, visual artists. They're just different ways that an artist can survive.
Thank you.
Paul.
Thanks, Karen, and thanks to all three of you for that really fascinating discussion. Barthes was very close to Julia Kristeva, who came up with the term intertextuality. And I don't mean it in that slightly vulgarized understanding that people use it, which is homage or influence or whatever. I mean, what she came up with was in its way as radically anti-romantic as the death of the author. So her sense of intertextuality, as you probably know, John, is that there is this cultural field and works of art are sort of borrowing bits from the cultural field just by dint of the fact that you're working in language or you're working in images or whatever. So there is no divine inspiration, there is no muse, etc. But I'm sort of wondering, I mean, as you were talking, isn't that just a sort of a much bigger version of writing a Jane Austen novel using the resources of other Jane Austen novels?
Yeah, which is why I tried to connect Barthes' idea of the digital scriptor, and he also has the idea of intertextuality similar to Kristeva. He says every work is a tissue of quotations, which is a great description of intertextuality. That's why I applied it to what an AI does, because that has the database, and it's a similar concept. I should say that I do talk about Kristeva and intertextuality, but go further back to the Russian formalists, which is where I think these ideas come from, as you'd know, and the great literary theorist Bakhtin, that I think is the great literary theorist who developed the idea of the work as a polyphonic text, heteroglossia, many voices throughout the work. And his writing wasn't translated into French till about 1965, and then had a big influence on Kristeva, the idea of the carnivalesque that she picks up with as well, and intertextuality. So the Russian formalists, going way back to the 20s, did it before anybody else. And they actually did literary theory and analysis while dispensing with the idea of the author altogether. Like props morphology of a folktale. There's no author. They're anonymous works, and that's how they did that kind of scientific analysis of narrative and how it works, and describe the relationship with other texts. So they and the French post-structuralists like Barthes and Christeva are all working on, it's probably an anti-humanist approach, because they're trying to reject the idea of human agency of authorship altogether, and have an idea that it's cultural language which is the generator of works. And both Christeva and Barthes were doing that, I think. That's why I think ironically that's been realized with AI systems, because AI, all that's doing is raiding the huge database of the internet of everything that's available, and reassembling the information and churning it out again and creating a new work. In a sense, Barthes and Christeva predicted that.
Thanks, John. Look, I think we as Karen has noted to me, we have a clutch of questions. So I think what we might try to do is ask them all and see what John can cope with in a matter of a few minutes.
Yeah, let's do a speed question and answer.
Speed question. Okay, so I'm going to read out Marcel, then we've got Stefan and Christian to quickly ask your questions. So Marcel's question is, what about creative cognitive processes that occur in creative practice? The work does seem to have come from somewhere or something that does this, that can feel. What do you think? So that's one for you, John. And then Stefan, if you're still there, Stefan.
Oh, yes, sorry, I can't share my video, but just quickly, John, I wondered if you had any thoughts on the related concept of the death of the critic, and if the kind of diffusion of meaning, or the turn from the author and the rise of the reader, has put the kind of stamp of authority back on the author, if the critic is now dead as well.
Yeah.
Okay, well, Stefan, and quickly to Christian, and then we'll let John reply to what he can. Christian.
Oh, okay. Thanks for that. Just very quickly, I wanted to ask a question about style. And if you talk about style, I mean, obviously, the linkage of style and authorship is a kind of exemplary romantic idea. You know, that the style is the man himself, as Buffon said. But also, just very briefly with ChatGPT, what's quite interesting is, yes, it can write, as we always say, in the style of X or Y, but the patterns, the stylistic patterns that it recognizes are very obscure in a large corpus of data. And we actually have, you know, computer scientists working out how ChatGPT works out stylistic features in a large corpus. So I was just wondering if you treated the question of style in the book. Okay,
do I do all three, Bridget? Very quickly.
John, do what you can in 2 or 3 minutes.
You'll have to remind me if I forget, but the first one was about cognitive theories of creativity. I do mention that because I try to find another ground beyond the kind of mystical, spiritual, religious idea of inspiration coming from this other place outside the individual self. And one way to look at it is through cognitive science and the studies of the brain in a creative state, which have been done. And the findings are generally that it's a certain frequency of brain waves, also called the alpha state, which slows down to such a level that increased connectivity is possible. And one of the theories of creativity is making unexpected connections. So there's some people have said that the alpha state is the creative state. Often it means the brain has to slow down, and it's often experienced in the hypnagogic state between sleep and waking, which is often why people try to get themselves into that position where the unconscious seems to be coming up, you know, because the brain has slowed down. That's the what I discovered about the cognitive science apprehension of the creative state as a kind of zone, you know, that people get into. And of course, historically, people have got into that zone through meditation, music, repetition, getting into a trance, probably similar to a trance state. So that would be the closest that cognitive science would come to an explanation of the creative state, I think.
Okay, thanks, John. Briefly, death of the critic.
Yes. Yeah. Bart says that with the old Romantic author, intention was always there. He had an accomplice, which was the critic, whose the job of the critic was to discern what the intention of the author was and explain it to readers. Bart rejects all that as well. So there's the idea that the critic shouldn't have any greater say in interpreting the text as the author, who's dead, the Romantic author. So therefore it was thrown open to everyone, every reader has an equal status as the person who can interpret or find meaning in the text. But I have noticed, and Stefan has brought to my attention, there's a lot on the internet where people want to know the intention of the author. Like book clubs, they might invite an author and say, what on earth were you intending by this? So it's as if it's a return decades after Bart has said, forget the intention of the author, it's irrelevant. Culture itself is writing all this, language is writing it. The author wouldn't know even if you asked them, but people still have a need to know what the intention of the author is. It hasn't died. There's a kind of return to emphasis on it. Stefan, is that what you're asking?
Yeah, that's exactly it. Thanks, John.
And the last one about style?
Very briefly, yes.
Yeah. Style was considered like the set of conventions or rules in a particular genre that an individual may express. And I noticed when an AI is set to do something in the style, say, of Raphael, make a painting, it first has to do the machine learning of learn the patterns of brushstrokes, etc. And then it replicates it. So we'll paint Karen in the style of Raphael based on what it has learned from studying the database of all those paintings. So it's a sense of learning and then reactivating and using another subject. So yes, it appears to be, as you said, and still not even understood exactly how it does it, that level. Is that what you're asking? I think style in that sense is reduced to the rules or patterns within a genre.
Thanks, John.
Fantastic.
Yeah, I think it would be, I must make sure that you and Christian follow up with each other after this. Look, I am going to wind it up because we usually are quite strict and I've already let myself down for the year. Huge thanks to Hsu-Ming Teo, our erstwhile head of department, as well as a brilliant scholar in her own right, and Karen Pearlman, Associate Professor Karen Pearlman, who is on sabbatical. I think this conversation led by them has really sort of shown the breadth of scholarship in this department and the sort of what ways in which tissues can be connected. So John, congratulations on this book. It is available from the University of Toronto Press. It's very reasonably priced. I've tweeted the link. Hsu-Ming is popping it up. We're totally shameless. So look, thank you to the three of you. And thank you again to Chris Muller for organising this. And finally, we will be convening in 4 weeks' time when Kath Kenny will be speaking about her new book, Staging a Revolution, in what should be a fantastic conversation with Michelle Arrow. So I'm going to stop the recording now and thank you all very much.
Thank you.